Hi everyone, I'd like to welcome today's guest Dave Carolan. Dave is currently the first team performance lead at Derby County, but and we're just having a discussion about generally how long he has been in this industry, whether it's 27 full seasons working in football, but he graduated 30 years ago back in 1995 from a sports science degree as well. So Dave, thank you for joining today as well, and it's weird to be recording a conversation with you because we have so many. This could last quite a while, so I do apologise in advance to the listeners as well. But thanks for joining.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I suppose like any old tree, if you cut through me, there's probably rings of experience that go on now, 30 years. But yeah, there's a few of us who've got those rings, to be sure.
We'll try not to cut through too many rings and keep it safe as well. But no, I really appreciate your time. And if anyone hasn't done so already, Dave actually hosts his own podcast with Gary Rowett called Breaking Lines, which is a really good listen, so I'd recommend that as well. So if you enjoy this episode, tune in and subscribe to Dave's podcast as well. But without further ado, the idea is to actually talk about the evolution of sports science, and Dave being 30 years within the industry probably is one of the leading people to actually ask this question. So Dave, do you want to give a quick brief overview of actually the timelines that you've gone, and then we'll get into some specifics around how sports science has evolved as well. So what's your journey been through the last 30 years? I'll just mute and have a drink while you tell the story.
Yeah, get a cup of tea and maybe some biscuits if you're a listener to this. But yeah, 30 years before the mass, I suppose, in sports science, and 27 of those around football. Strangely enough, started off as a rugby player when I came over to university at St Mary's. Playing out of London Irish, I was doing okay as a rugby player, and as all good sports people who never actually make it, they have an excuse, and mine was an injury. So I concentrated more on sports science and had some great early experiences there, because around the time that rugby was going professional, we had this young whippersnapper up and coming head coach arrived at London Irish at the time, called Clive Woodward. Yeah, he wasn't a sir at that stage, but went on to become a knight of the realm. But saw some early innovation in what Clive was willing to think about and embrace in order to try and make the sport go forward. So there was me, fresh out of university, but had been playing down there, so I was around the club. And I got a chance to start moving into video analysis in the first instance, because I was out with a back injury, so all I could do was basically hold a video camera, but started doing some video stuff. And then once I graduated, I was working out of a sports injuries clinic. I was managing that, and then we got the contract to work with Clive and London Irish, delivering all of the sports science and fitness kind of programs. So I looked after that, and basically 3 years later, excuse me, I ended up in football. And then over the last 27 years, yeah, what have we seen? We've seen an explosion in all sorts of areas in sports science and performance, from just the amount of people that now work in those aspects of the sport. You only have to go to any training ground now, and it's an army of performance related people who serve the team, serve the players, serve the club in all different aspects, be it sports science, be it strength and conditioning, analysis, nutrition, psychology, or whatever. And then, of course, all of the technologies and systems and platforms that are available, not only to us as the practitioners, but also to the players themselves. So I think across that journey, seeing it grow from, I suppose we were the ones who were slash and burning our way through this thick undergrowth, whereas now it's a motorway, isn't it? Anybody who wants to work in performance or sports science now can literally jump into it. Your path is before you. You can zoom your way right to the front of the crowd now, and start innovating for the next 30 years if you want.
Because there's a lot to dive into within that as well, and we could have just ended the podcast there and said, right, job done, see you later. But I think because I get the privilege and honour of getting to speak to you quite regularly on things like this, and I remember you telling me stories about even just when was it Norwich that you first started off at as well? And like, we talk a lot about technology nowadays, and GPS like is a mainstay. There's a prime example. What was kind of like your strategies to quantifying internal and external load, or was that even a strategy back when you first started because of how technology has evolved and it's so easily accessible now? What was it actually like back then, and how's your philosophy adapted over time as well? I'll say, and I'll mute for another 20 minutes or so and get.
Well, I was fortunate to work with a couple of great practitioners who were far more established than me in that first role at Norwich. So I had Joe Dunbar, who was like a really experienced and respected physiologist, and Keith Power, who was a psychologist. So they were the ones who actually brought me in to be this multidisciplinary sports scientist who would be basically full-time at the club. And there were only a few practitioners back in those days across all 92 clubs, and probably globally there weren't that many people who were working full-time in sports science in clubs. You had Ed Baranowski and other people who were providing services into clubs but more part-time. So those services were available for kind of every Tuesday and Thursday. People would pop in and do S&C sessions or fitness with the team. So back then, what did we have? Well, the only thing we really had was internal load monitoring, and that was through Polar Accurex Plus watches. So each player in the first team and in the youth team, to be fair, at Norwich, they did invest into it, had a watch. So every player, every single day, wore a watch and a chest strap. The technology was still really, really good, but you didn't have a way of downloading all the information at once. So every day I'd have to give out all the watches, ensure all the players had turned them on, which, as you can imagine, trying to get players back then to wear a heart rate monitor was a real challenge. Like nowadays, it's quite easy. Everyone expects to wear a GPS monitor, a heart rate monitor, an Aura ring, whatever it is. It's just simple for them. It's just what's expected. But back then, this was like revolutionary. So getting a player to wear the heart rate strap and not throw it on the ground every 5 minutes when it was falling down around their abdomen, making sure that they had started and stopped it. And then it literally took about 2 hours to download all of the heart rates at the end of every day. But what did that give you? Well, it gave you real kind of schooling in understanding your technology and respecting it and looking after it, because this was your only form of having any form of load monitoring going on. But actually all of the data we were collecting from that was all ascertained through doing like lactate testing, which Joe kind of carried out in those early days, really bespoke and individualized training zones for all of the players using a software. The Polar Precision software back then was really, really good at being able to individualize heart rate zones and things like that, which, looking at it today, you still struggle with a lot of that stuff on a lot of the technologies. But that was what we had for load monitoring. There was no external load monitoring bar your eyes. But as a coach on the side of a pitch, because when we go pitch side, we become coaches as well, don't we? We're not just stood there with a lab coat on and watching training as a scientist. You're becoming a coach, a fitness coach per se. But you would get a great understanding of how training was essentially designed, how it was delivered, and then you had to speak to the players. You actually had to sit down and say, how hard was that? Almost this mad Borg scale, which now becomes obviously sessional RPE, but using a Borg scale and holding it up for the players and getting them to point at cards and writing it down. And that actually formed the basis of my master's thesis, which was looking at how I actually prescribed pre-season program, where we were separating out the football training and the conditioning into two parts. So we were looking after the conditioning, the coaches were looking after the football side, and then also getting an understanding of player and coach assessment of like almost their sessional RPE for each session and how hard they thought each day was. And and then using this prescribed program to look at the difference between players who were not on the prescribed program and the players who were, and just looking at the changes that happened across that preseason. So yeah, really, really interesting when that was early sports science, and a club like Norwich allowing us to actually do that.
Well, even things like lactate testing, and like Joe's obviously done a great job and moved into like the salivary analysis like kind of industry as well, and doing brilliant things there. But even lactate testing, not many clubs are actually doing that now, so it's still quite a revolutionary kind of strategy that you were using back then as well. Like, is that something you still implement now, or has it become harder to do things like that?
Yeah, I think there is more of a challenge now to do that kind of deeper physiological testing, because essentially nobody wants to. It's the same challenge we had back then with the bleep test, which was, why do we need to take the players out of a whole day's worth of testing to do a test you're going to do maybe 3 or 4 times a year, when we can just do this, batch testing on a player using, back then, bleep, yo-yo it became, and now it's kind of mass testing or whatever you want. So the alternative tests and assessments are quicker and easier to administrate. The other ones, like lactate testing or VO2 or whatever you decide to do, are going to be expensive and time consuming. So it does come down to costs sometimes. At some clubs they just don't have the facilities to be able to access that kind of stuff, which I think is always a weak argument, because there's plenty of universities who can provide those services, and they'll actually come to you if you've got the facility to be able to do that. If not, it's a case of booking some time. But I think, given a preference, I will always try and go for that kind of level of physiological testing, because I think at heart we are physiologists to a certain extent. We want to understand that kind of individualized physiology, that we can then work on very specific elements of the individual's development, while not necessarily having to put it down to a test like a mass test, where we know is going to be a certain amount of motivation. It was always the challenge with the yo-yo and the bleep test, wasn't it? If somebody decided to want to pull out early, they just pulled out early. If someone wants to run a slower mass test, they just run a slower mass test, and then by the second time they do it, they look like they've made big improvements. So Joe was doing all the lactate tests. He was doing urea and CK, and he was doing some brilliant stuff back then. But I suppose the challenge was then there was obviously a cost for that, and whether clubs would continue to pay for it. And I think that's ultimately why clubs ended up going back towards this kind of batch testing, simplified testing model.
We'll come on to that probably later on, because there's a huge cost to what is currently sports science and really how it's evolved. And there is a simple method, as you talked about, which is low cost, but then most clubs it's expensive kind of department now as well, because of staffing, technologies and everything else and so on. But when did you start to see the shift from subjective to internal kind of load to then now being a very fixated on external load kind of industry, in your opinion?
Well, even back then, one thing I've always tried to maintain in my own career is trying to be innovative. So very early, about 2002-3, we decided at the club that there has to be a way of trying to understand and get some kind of objective data around how far the players were running, because Prozone and Asensio, I think it was, or Sport Universal, who were the French version of Prozone. And for those who know their history, they know that they both fell out and then ultimately fell back in again. But
was that what Amisco became?
Was it Amisco? I'm struggling to remember. Obviously, once you get to this age, you start forgetting stuff. But notwithstanding that, the two, Prozone was on the roll then, so people were starting to pick it up. We actually got approached at Norwich because we were doing some very early analysis work with a company from the northeast called Castle Sport, and we were using the Stats 2020, which was an Australian model. So not only was this physiology stuff going on, and I was covering most of that, but with Joe, but then we had all this live analysis work starting to happen as well. So my role was like hugely multidisciplined in terms of physiology, day-to-day fitness work on the pitch, strength and conditioning, supporting the nutrition team, and the analysis. So Prozone had come on board, and we're looking for early clubs. We were one of the clubs that they approached, but there's a story why we didn't go early with it at Norwich. But we suddenly started to get this objective data coming through about how far players were running in games. So while we had this infrastructure at the stadium telling us all about the game-related metrics, we had nothing at training to be able to give us the same stuff. Some of that was just a challenge of infrastructure, like there was no internet. So people nowadays are like struggle if it's not gigabit internet. Like we were literally on dial-up speeds of like 28k. So yeah, that'll just date me even more there.
How many of the listeners do you think remember the modem call-up signal to internet, where if you had a microphone like what we're speaking into now, you'd get a phone call and you knew the phone call was coming, or your microphone knew it was coming before you even like had the phone call?
There you go. Yeah, so you'd start to hear that buzz on the speakers, knowing that you had a phone call coming in. But yeah, these are the days of WAP before there was 3G. So. But we had done a partnership at Norwich with Lotus. Lotus cars are only about 4 miles from where I'm living now. So Lotus were always at the height of research around motor cars, race cars, Formula One. Obviously, they had a Formula One team. They always had done really interesting things with car design. So their engineering company and the club, we got together and started looking at what things could we create in the world of sport and performance. And one of the ideas, two ideas were kind of coming out. One was we proposed a way of having Bluetooth markers. So there was early Bluetooth version 1. So essentially my thought was if we could make some of the marker cones into Bluetooth beacons and then put a transmitter on the back of the player, essentially we could triangulate. Basically, I've got a history in sailing, and to know anywhere you want to be on the earth, you can either use a sextant or you can use triangulation. So using triangulation, we'd know where somebody was on the pitch because it'd have reference cones, and we'd know how fast, what direction, rotation, and all of that. So we played around with that, and then they said, well, actually, we work with a company in Cambridge called Pi Research, and they were the people who were doing the data dumps in Formula One cars. So back then, a Formula One car could only do data reception and transmission as it came past the pit wall. So the speed of transmission had to be unbelievably fast. So Pi Research came down to Norwich, and we started looking at these the use of these really basic GPS transmitters you could use for your car, and we had a little PDA. It's not an equivalent of this kind of PDA, but it's something more simple than that. Don't ask why that's on my desk, by the way. That's not a prop. But essentially, they brought down a radar, a full military grade radar system down to the training ground, and we put we had this day where we just did a whole load of different types of testing about how could we track players. So we had players running around in bibs with reflectors on them, because the radar would be able to pick up on the reflection that was being sent out from whatever the radar system was sending out. Radio beacons or whatever. So we started looking at that. I think that was about 2002, 3 or something like that. Maybe a little bit later. And then Pi Research actually came back to us a week later. So this just giving people some kind of timestamp. About a week later, they came back and they showed us the drill taking place in this kind of everybody moving, and you could see all of the people moving around on the pitch. So that was quite fun. And that's when we started seeing, like, right, the objective data that we wanted to get from training, the metrics that we would want to see, was there a way of getting that? And then around the same time in Australia, I think GP Sports were starting to do some stuff with basic GPS as well. So I suppose at the same time as I'm trying to think about something here, then over in Australia, somebody else is thinking about it. And obviously it was a godsend then when something like GP Sports had actually cracked it.
Yeah, and it was fascinating. There was probably when I just started in the industry as well, like around that 2004, 2005 period where there was just that boom and people realised, oh, we can use the technology and it's actually useful as well. Like, I know you showed the phone earlier, and for anyone listening as well, it's like basically a big brick block type phone, and that was what the first GPS, the GP Sports one, it had a little curve in it that dug into the back as well, like if I remember. So it's yeah, it's there's a long history of technology, but if that like I'm interested, how did you actually run like a needs analysis then to actually decide what metrics you wanted? Because there wasn't a company telling you this is what you should use, like we have a lot nowadays, and we've learnt a lot from 20, 30 years of sports science research and insights from academia, from practice. Where do you actually establish like your needs analysis when you're starting off at that point?
Well, I suppose you also stand on the shoulders of giants of the industry who've gone there before and thought about it. You know, bigger brains than me have thought about this for much longer. So you had the likes of Tom Riley, obviously, up at Liverpool, John Moores, who was, you know, groundbreaking in all the kind of locomotion studies that he had done in the early days. And I suppose at that stage, even at Division One or Championship level, as the league was back then before it changed names. You know, you were starting to talk to coaches about what they valued in their teams. You know, and I suppose everyone calls it now a game model, doesn't it? You know, and it's all about how they play. But back then it was also, well, you know, maybe football in some ways was a little bit simpler. We didn't understand the kind of physical side probably as much, apart from that, you know, I suppose people wanted to cover ground quickly. They wanted to close down as opposed to pressing. You know, some teams wanted to close down. Some people wanted to just get back into shape, which is now kind of getting back into a low block or whatever you want to call it. So the language was simpler because, you know, times were simpler. And you have to remember that there's always a time shift of back then of coaches. So coaches and managers would have played the game maybe. So I was working with Bruce Rioch, who had probably finished playing in the 80s, and this was the late 90s. So it's like nearly 20 years or 15 years since Bruce stopped playing. So his reference point as a player is back in the 70s when he was in like championship winning teams and playing at World Cups. Then he comes through his period of being a really successful coach. And now he's taken that methodology, and it's now that old methodology of an older player and, you know, a kind of a current manager meeting this whole new stuff that's coming on board. So what did he value? He valued hard running players. He valued players who could play full 90s. I mean, I'm just doing some stats now, looking at, you know, the last 25 years of players in the league who are completing 46 games, and you know you're seeing quite a steep drop off now in players who are doing that, especially outfield players. For example, this year I think in the championship only one outfield player potentially has completed every single minute of the games. Now I go back to say the Norwich team that we had in 2003-4, where I think we had three in that team alone who nearly completed every minute. So apart from goalkeepers, you're seeing like outfield players not completing full seasons of every minute. Now, that'll probably shock a lot of people that you think, like, why can these players not keep up with that? But I suppose over that whole time, once we started to see what the coaches valued, then we could start building the training a little bit more around that, to develop the training, to develop the programs around how we prepare the players to play. You know, we just had the academy systems coming online now, so we were now seriously getting down to how do we prepare the players to be the professionals, to play the game, how the managers want to.
Yeah, so coming back, that stat's an interesting stat, and while it might shock some people, actually, is that surprising? Are sports scientists, so again, people like yourself who are working within the industry, because we're better informed, because we have better strategies to monitor athletes and players, are we actually managing them better? Or, and again, I'll throw the devil's advocate comment out there, are we being too protective of players? Like, is there a balance between what a player is capable of doing versus like, are we just pushing standards on too high that they can't cope with now and standards change? So it's an interesting discussion point, one that I'm sure you'll have a lot of interesting conversations with over the next couple of weeks. But yeah, your thought, is it better management, higher standards, or we're being too protective?
I mean, that's a $64 million question, isn't it? And even that's gone up in inflation. It's probably $64 billion question now. How do we manage these players to allow them to play the game as often as possible at the highest level? Is the game, are we seeing more games? No, we're not, in my opinion. I think the numbers that we're seeing in terms of games available to players per year in the championship has largely stayed the same for the last 30 years. In fact, there's an argument that they've actually reduced slightly, because in 1998 every League Cup game had 2 rounds, so you played the first round home and away and you played the second round home and away. So the FA Cup was still the same, and there were still the same amount of teams that are in the league that are today, in terms of there being 24 teams. So you always had 46 games. The Cup was whatever it was, but then in the League Cup you potentially had a few more. So that's in some ways a mute argument in some respects. Squads are a little bit bigger in some ways, because you now have a 21s team. Back then it was just first team and youth team. So essentially you've now got more players available, who are closer to an age where you'd probably use them more within the first team. Of course, we've got more subs nowadays, so there's an easier way of making changes to games. So that means if you don't have to play someone for longer in a game, you can make a substitution, So I started off with 3 subs. So there was always a debate whether we'd have a goalkeeper on the bench. People would probably laugh at that nowadays, but there was seriously a debate around which of your squad members was an alternate goalkeeper if you needed to play, if you needed to have 3 subs on the bench, one of which wasn't a goalkeeper. So nowadays, of course, you can rotate the team a little bit easier with all of those subs. So maybe the fact that we're not seeing 46 games completed every single minute is because you don't have to, But then, are we seeing a reduction in injuries? I think if you speak to most professionals, especially after this season or the last couple of seasons, they'd all probably say, no, we're not seeing a reduction in injuries. In fact, probably we're seeing more injuries. And the whole more injuries thing comes down to, well, let's look at a player back in 1998 from when I started. If he felt something, there was no such thing as an awareness back then. It was just, are you sore? Yes, I'm sore. Okay, have a couple of days off feet. Don't train for a couple of days. Get you back out Thursday. How do you feel? I feel okay, and off you go. Those were players who are probably running around with like a 2A or a 1B kind of injury, who after 3 or 4 days, once the pain had subsided and they'd taken some anti-inflammatories and painkillers, felt fine, and they just continue on. Now, there's probably an argument for, is the game faster and all of that? And there are certainly stats that seem to show that, and there's plenty of research out there by learned colleagues who will tell you that the game is faster, it's harder, there's more high-speed running and so on. But I've looked up over some of the old Prozone stats, and because they're using absolute metrics that we're also using or can use today, some of the stats are pretty similar, in terms of distance covered and even high-speed running and sprint distances. Like, maybe I'll post some of them online, on my socials, but they're not numbers that are alien to me. I'm not seeing numbers now which are like literally off the charts. High-end players back then could still perform high-end physical performances in games. So I suppose when you're looking at it, why do we not see players playing as much? Maybe it's all of the things around the game, which is we are trying to load manage players, and sometimes we're doing that too much. And in my opinion, you have the capability of managing them because you have all of these numbers. But then that comes down to also, have you got the intuition to know when somebody needs to be managed versus just relying on the numbers to make that for you?
It's a really challenging concept as well, because there's a lot of people now paid, that is their job. You manage load, and this terminology of even load is in general is like a really big debate that we'll probably won't go into for this conversation as well. But so, given like the evolution as well, because we could go on about, obviously we've talked about internal and external, but there's things like data visualization evolution, there's just communication evolution, as you say, Wi-Fi versus blooming modem dial-up versus WhatsApp chat groups versus pigeon carriers and stuff like that, carrier pigeons.
Not that old.
No. Well,
Smoke signal.
Morse code, you would have used that early on as well?
Yeah,
I'm sure.
Morse code. Yeah,
Morse
yeah.
code as well, sorry. So there's all these like evolutions now as well. I suppose one of the interesting things to kind of like conclude the discussion, I would say, is actually like here's the previous 30 years of evolution. Blank canvas now, what would be the future evolutions that would actually add to that and maybe challenge the how do we get back to players playing 46 games consistently? Like, have we gone too far one way, or what's kind of the future evolutions? Because it's not just internal and external load monitoring now. We've got technology coming out our ears. So what do we need to remember and focus on to make sure we keep down the right path and not let all this noise come in as part of the evolution? How do we focus evolution, shall we say?
I think one of the big challenges for the future is, let's be honest, football alongside other sports is entertainment. So it's going to be driven by the people who are essentially paying for it, So whether that's, broadcasters, or whether that's someone like FIFA or UEFA who want more competitions because that drives commercial sides and sponsorship and brings more money, which means more games. And then they're going to go down the route of thinking, well, how do we maintain the quality? If there's going to be more games, we need to maintain quality. Well, maybe we need to look at how the game is played. And you've seen the rules and the laws change to try and promote more ball in play time. We've got more law changes coming in next year around, goalkeepers where they previously could manage the pace of a game by catching the ball, lying down on it, and suddenly it's taken 30 seconds for them to release it. Next year we're going to see, inside 8 seconds of them receiving the ball, they have to have released it. So that's going to speed up the game again. And that's the next evolution. We saw it when they started talking about, the increase in the number of subs. Or we saw that the ball and play time was going to be increased because they're going to add on even more time at the end of the games a couple of years ago, which kind of came and went very, very quickly when they realised that that's essentially another 4 games work or load onto the players. So I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that at one end is the people who are driving, who want more football and higher quality football, versus us at the other end, which is trying to provide the people on the stage to allow them to do that. And unfortunately, we're probably going to be the ones who are least consulted in terms of how that manifests itself, because probably the money people at the top will always get sway, and then they will influence the rule makers, law changers, to have to come up with some kind of intervention to allow that. Now, what does that look like? Could football become 4 quarters? Is that possible? Will they add more subs again? Will we go to a 6th sub? Will we allow other ways of having rotations like they have in AFL? I think you also have to look to other sports to see how they've amended what they've done in the same challenge. Rugby now have essentially 7 subs. Football has now got 5 subs. So you're now at a point where there's almost 50% of the outfield players in football can be changed across a game. Will they provide more chances for you to do that rather than have to do always in blocks of, you can only do it in 3 blocks or 1 at half time, which is a 4th opportunity. Will they change that? We've got other challenges around the environment, pitches and so on, which hugely affect how the game is played. The game can get faster for longer now because the pitches are so good. So that means at the end of the game isn't deteriorating in pace. There's no decay now in physiological output through a game for the game than will be for some of the players who are having to play the full 90 minutes. And I think they're the ones that we have to be most cognizant about, is the players who are doing repeated 90s, who are having this. I've debated it with a few people over the last couple of years, which is, I think training is going to have to change in the future as well, because we're now seeing essentially 4 spikes in a game. We're seeing the start of the game, we're seeing somewhere around 30 minutes to 40 minutes a second spike. We're seeing straight after half time, and then we're seeing the spike at the end of the game where the game is not naturally decaying in its output. It's actually going back up. And if you're a player who's playing 90s regular, you've got to be ready for this like 95-minute game, maybe 100-minute game that's having another rise in intensity at the end of the game. What does that often mean? It means that players who are tiring, who've had to pace their way through the game, are getting exploited by fast players who've come on fresh, who can take advantage of them. And that, of course, changes game state, because there's now more goals at the end of games, which means tactics change as well. So there's so much going into it, but we're going to have to look at how we train the players, how we prepare them, how we recover them, the technologies that we're using to try and look at what's happening internally, potentially in games, because we've got the external load, but how do we use things like potentially, continuous glucose monitors and other devices like that to be able to see actually what's going on with this player during the game. I can see his numbers are dropping, but why is that? Is that because something else is going on? And they're going to be really, really exciting interventions when they start to become more commonplace.
Yeah, I think that element of looking at the response or how someone is doing something versus what we've done really well over the past, especially the last 10, 15 years, is what a player's doing. And some of us, yourself mainly, Dave, over the last 30 years have been doing what other players been doing. And I suppose it's asking that how next and really diving into that further. So I just want to thank you, Dave. Enjoyable conversation, we always do. And I suppose, are there any concluding comments that you want to suggest about where you see the evolution of sports science going any further? You've talked about the different strategies and anything else, but what about for you? Where do you personally feel like you would want to take your practice that isn't available here and now, whether that be monitoring constant blood analysis, for example, as an internal response, or are there any other directions that you feel you'd want to do as concluding comment?
Yeah, I think we're going to be pretty stacked with technologies and systems that are going to support us. We need good decision makers, and I think we're at a point now where departments are so big that you need good people at the top of them that can make good critical decisions fast on the side of a pitch, or at least help the people who are on the side of the pitch make those decisions better. I think in the race to kind of get up the ladder, people in our industry need to spend time on task, because to get to the point where, like me and a few of our colleagues, many of which Steve, to last this long, you have to have a real passion for it, but they've also done a lot of groundwork. So I think there's a lot of fast burn going on. People want to get up to the top quick, then find out it's extremely stressful at that top end, and get out fast, because it is 24/7, 365. But I think the whole stuff around data analytics now is just massive, isn't it? So for me, it's trying to stay learning and stay ahead of the curve if I can, or at least keep up with the youngsters as they're coming through with all this great technology and interventions that they see. And then helping the future players, isn't it? In the end, we see this kind of conveyor belt of players come through and they fall off at the other end, hopefully haven't had a good career with minimal injuries, where if we've left the industry in a good place, that they feel like sports science and performance has helped them perform better, same for the coaches, same for all the other staff, then I think that's really what we should be aspiring to as an industry, is that people leave thinking that sports science has helped them have a good career and not got in their way, that it's actually supported them from below. And permitted them to go and perform at the highest level that they can.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dave, and again, thank you for your time, and hopefully it would not take up too much of the off-season time for you as well. And yeah, if anyone wants to get in touch with you after this, Dave, I know we talked about the podcast already at the start, but what's the best way to reach out to you if anyone wants to ask you any questions on some of what was discussed?
Oh, through the old tried and tested methods of probably LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, any of those. I go by my name, just Dave Carolan. So yeah, I'm nice and simple to find on most of those platforms. But if people also want to email, you can just get me at dave@davecarolan.com.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate your time. Thanks to everyone for listening today, and enjoy the rest of your time.